in here. So, we've been in this really fun series. Have you guys had fun with this summer? It's been kind of interesting, kind of, a cool idea to play with, like, the greatest hits of Jesus. And kind of having some fun with, like, thinking of the greatest hits when it comes to music and how there's those songs that we go back to and we know them again and again and again and we can sing along to them. And I wonder if you've had this happen before, where you're listening to one of the songs that you've listened to again and again and again, and maybe you listened to it at a different point in your life when you were younger or something, and now you have adult ears, and you're listening to the song, and you're like, oh, I never noticed that that song said that. You ever had that moment before? Maybe it's like a song that was in, like, for my age, my generation, it's like a song that was written in the 90s that, like, in the backseat we just kind of bopped along to, and then you're an adult and you're listening to it, and you're like, Mom, you let me sing that when I was 8? Like, what is going on? Sometimes you hear a line that you didn't notice before, and all of a sudden it seems to change the way that you're thinking about that song, and you kind of have to work through that, right? That's what we get to do with the passage that we have for today. It's a story that we have probably heard many times before, but when we give it a close read, there's a couple lines in there that, well, I think I'm just going to read it, and we'll see what it does for us, all right? The quick situating, I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 25. And in this chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus actually tells 3 parables. And we're going to read the second one. And all the parables are about the kingdom of God. He's teaching about the kingdom. So that'll make sense when he begins with it. He's referring to the kingdom, and the hearers would have known what he was talking about. So let's read. I'm going to read this passage, and if it's helpful for you, it's kind of a longer passage. If it helps you to close your eyes to kind of picture and imagine what's going on, you can do that. If the passage is so long that would potentially make us feel sleepy, don't do that, But here, let's read this story that Jesus tells his disciples. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. And to one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. And then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. And his master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Did y'all remember how that story ended? Whoa. Yeah, we got some stuff to unpack here, don't we? I'll mention one little clarification. You may have heard this story originally as the parable of the talents. Have you heard that before, the parable of the talents? And that is, it goes back to the way that biblical translators tend to work with the original language and how they pull certain things in. There's certain words that were used in that day that we don't really use today, and they have to make this decision. Do we just pull the old word and kind of put that in, or do we try to make that in a word that we make sense of? And so traditionally it was talents. The Greek word is talentos. Say that with me. Talentos, right? And so it literally, a talent, that's kind of what it would translate to most directly. And what that means is 20 years' wages of a day laborer. So Jesus tells us this is a lot of money. Like, imagine, do the math of what, you filed on your taxes last year. Multiply that by 20. And this master gave 5 of those to that first servant, right? So this is like a lot of money, okay? And so the NIV, as it's been retranslated and redone, they just called it bags of gold to kind of put it in language that we use today, that it's like bags of gold, you know what I'm saying? Like it's a lot of money. But it does create this kind of interesting kind of question, confusion sometimes. When the word talent is used, like in our in English in the 21st century, talent is like, Matt has a talent at singing and playing guitar, right? This is like a gift or an ability. And so it can sometimes create these interesting things where, like, we hear the parable of the talents, and do we think about money? Do we think about, like, talents or gifts? And should we do one or the other? And it's kind of an interesting question, right? I'm just going to pause that one right there and say we'll come back to that when we tie some things together. But just to say that, like, some people tend to look at both of them, right? Can we hold on to some of that tension and we'll come back to it? Say yes. Great, cool, awesome. So then I'll move on. But let's talk about that ending. Holy cats, did that sound harsh? Judgment. The judgment of the third servant. Not only a harsh judgment, but seemingly a penalty that is given. He is cast out. He is told that he will be in the place in the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. That part of the story is really striking for me, but the other part that was really striking for me came a little bit earlier. It's when the third servant presents the talent back to the master. In verses 24 and 25. I want to highlight this for us. The servant says, "Master, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground." It's a really interesting thing for the third servant to say to the master, right? He gives his explanation for why he hid it in the ground, but you see how he characterized his master. You are a hard man. Now, of course, the master responds by wasting no time reprimanding this servant and then punishing him. And yeah, this harsh judgment of the third servant, it really catches me off guard. And maybe it's because in the typical reading, I've heard this story many times, I'm sure many of you have, that we see the master as Jesus, right? That Jesus is the master. And Jesus, the one who I love and who loves me, it's just hard to see the master be so seemingly harsh. And maybe it's because I like to pay more attention to the first and the second servants because I want to identify with them and their faithfulness, and I like to hear Jesus say to me, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Maybe it's because of that I am so caught off guard by what happens with this third servant. Maybe it's because of a lot of the other parables that Jesus taught. Like last week when Matt talked about the workers in the vineyard, it was a story all about God's incredible generosity. That God will give in powerful ways, and Matt reminded us that how God gives to another person shouldn't make a difference in how we think about how God is giving to us. And so it's a story about how God's great abundance is present, and then we get to this story, and the master lays down the hammer. It almost begs a question for me as I read this story. Was the third servant right? Think about it. What he said to the master was, I knew you were a hard man. Was he right? Does he have a point? I mean, who is this master? Does this master really deserve service? I mean, would you want to serve this master? Even if you put yourself in the shoes of the first or the second servants, would this story be good news? I mean, are we comfortable with a master like this so long as we're part of the in group? We're just cool with servant 3 being cast out because at least I did what I needed to do, so I've got my 10 talents now. Are we comfortable with that kind of master? Those of you who've heard me preach for a little while now know that I like to raise really hard questions. So this story is difficult, right? Let's zoom out a little bit. I mentioned that this story is the second one between 2 other parables in chapter 25, all right? So we're going to zoom out just for a moment and look at those 3 parables, just the names. I've got the headings up here so we can see this, right? The chapter begins, Jesus tells a parable of 10 young bridesmaids. And it's this story where they are waiting for the groom to return. There were 5 of them who were wise, and they had oil in the lamps. And there were 5 who were foolish and did not have oil in the lamps. And then the report came that the groom was coming, and the 5 who didn't have the oil were like, oh no, we need to go get oil. And can we have some of yours? And the first 5 were like, well, we need to have we need, so I guess you need to go out and find your own. So they went out to find their own. While they were out, the groom came back, and those second 5 weren't there. They were left in the dark. Kind of a parable about those who are waiting, and are they prepared to wait for the coming of the groom. Then we have our story, the parable of the valuable coins, the parable of the talents, whatever we want to call this. And then finally we have a story that the Common English Bible, the header is Judgment of the Nations. It's a powerful header for a story. The story that this is the story of the sheep and the goats, of how in the end of times the shepherd will separate the sheep from the goats. The story of the king who said, you clothed me when I was naked, you fed me when I was hungry, you visited me while I was in prison. And they said, when did we do that? And he said, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And then he says, you did not visit me, you did not clothe me, you did not feed me. When did we not do that? Whatever you didn't do for the least of these, you did not do for me. So zooming out, we get this whole context. The first story, the story of a groom, and are the bridesmaids, are they ready? Are they waiting for the groom to come? And then the story after this is a story of the judgment of the nations. We kind of get a sense that in chapter 25, in all of this, we're talking about end times. There's only 28 chapters in the book of Matthew. This is toward the end of Jesus' teaching, and we get the sense that he is giving his disciples and us who read this now, it's like the last words that he's giving, helping them to look ahead for what is to come. And in some ways, the swiftness of the master's judgment seems to make a little bit more sense when we map it on to the end times, right? This isn't an issue of a master who is harsh. If anything, Jesus is giving the disciples a warning. He's saying, look, I want you to be prepared and to look ahead to what is to come. However, it's not totally just about the future, right? Jesus is also giving very clear present in this life instruction. I think especially in that last story. Whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. And it almost seems like in that story, Jesus is leaving the parable style behind and just speaking really plainly with some action-oriented examples. What we do for others relates to what we do for God. He makes that connection explicit. That's an idea that we'll come back to again as well. But for now, if we put these 3 parables together, I think it gives us a little bit more of a nuanced, fuller picture of Jesus. That Jesus in this chapter, he is a teacher who is providing a heads up, providing a warning, but he does so out of love. He does so as a leader who shows that he cares for the hungry, for the naked, and the imprisoned, so much so that he identifies as one of them. I don't know about for you, but for me, when I put this in context, I see this master a little differently, because a master who's willing to identify with the least of these, now that would be a master that I would be willing to serve. And that brings us back to servant 3 of his accusation that his master is harsh. And it raises this question for me, why did he see the master as harsh when the other two didn't? Why did he see the master different than how we might see Jesus in the context of all of the parables in chapter 25? I think it comes down to one word. In fact, he used the word when he was giving his reason. He said, "I knew you were a hard man, and so I was afraid." Fear is why the third servant sees the master as a hard man. He saw the master through a lens of fear. And interestingly enough, as a result, he acted in ways that just ended up confirming his greatest fears. It almost seems like one of those stories of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know those kinds of stories where someone is expecting something to happen, and so they act in a way that, oh, lo and behold, the thing happened, because they just knew it was going to happen. And in some ways, we might even be able to understand a little bit of the third servant's fear if we try to explore that a little bit. Going back to the story, remembering that a talent was a huge sum of money, right? It was a huge responsibility for the servants. The story says the master left his wealth. This appeared to be a wealthy man. I mean, if we can do the math, so 5 talents to the first one, that's 100 years of wages, and then 2 talents to the other, that is 40 years of wages. And then 10 for the, it's 150 years of wages that the master has left to these 3 guys. All right? So even the third one getting 20 years of wages with the 1 talent, I mean, that's a really high responsibility. Would you be afraid if someone gave you a ton of wealth and was like, I want you to manage this? Especially if he saw his master as a hard man, it's kind of like, don't mess this up. 20 years of wages is a lot of money. If you mess this up, that could be a real problem for you. So we could see why he might have felt some of that fear about what do I do with this. Now, it's interesting, when we connect it to fear, there's another connection that we can make. I want to tie in one more section of Scripture that I think gives us a little bit of insight. And this goes back to the idea of how sometimes when we call it talents, we start thinking of talents. We start thinking of gifts and abilities, right? And that kind of brings to mind when the Apostle Paul, later in the New Testament, talks about spiritual gifts. And he talks about spiritual gifts in lots of places. I'm thinking in particular, one of the common sections is in 1 Corinthians chapters 12 through 15. It's this really long section. He devotes 4 chapters talking about spiritual gifts and how they would be used in the church. And he talks about how these gifts are amazing that God gives to the church and to each one of us, and we all have this part to play. But between chapters 12 and 15, one of the chapters in the middle is chapter 13. Does anybody remember what 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is about? I'll give you a hint. You often hear it at weddings. Love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love keeps no record of wrongs. What holds this whole section together is love. What holds together all of the gifts that God gives is love. In fact, Paul goes on to say that even if I have all of these gifts, if I can speak eloquently, maybe I can play guitar as good as Matt can play. If I do not have love, all of my gifts are a clanging gong. Did you catch that? If you didn't, I just want to make sure. Everything is like a clanging gong. I always wanted to be a drummer, so that was kind of my chance to play with that. Thanks. It's a powerful image, right? Or sound. of like, that's not a pleasant thing. Could you imagine just hearing that for 30 or so minutes during a message, right? If there is not love, that is basically what it sounds like, no matter what the gift is. What Paul reminds us is that our gifts, our talents, I might even say the gifts of financial resources, to bring it back to money, they are meant to be rooted in love. That's a pretty big contrast with fear, right? Back to our story. Before the master leaves on his journey, the last things that he leaves with his servants are the talents, the gold. And it kind of made me think, before Jesus left, what was the last thing that Jesus left us before he ascended into heaven? There's a lot of things we could answer that with. One place I might look is in the Gospel of John, where he's in the upper room with his disciples, and he says this, I give you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, so you also must love each other. This is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, when you love each other. One of the last things that Jesus gives us before he ascends is his love. And why does Jesus give us his love? The passage said it, so that we would take that love and love others. God gives us his love because he loves us and wants us to use that love to multiply it in the world. This love that we are given is not meant to be given and, buried in a hole. It is meant to be multiplied. So the third servant, how did he see his master? As harsh. And so in his eyes, what did his master give him? Did he give him money? Did he give him an obligation to do the master's bidding? Did the third servant see this as, this is duty service for the sake of duty? Did the third servant look at this as a massive responsibility that he wasn't prepared for? He had fear about, what if I don't have enough? What if I can't do what the master is asking? Did the third servant think what the master asked was far too great a risk? And so out of fear, he just buried it. What a contrast to love, right? The difference. I might even read a little bit into this story. When you notice the first two servants, they take what the master gave them, and then when they come back, I don't want to overdo this, but you almost hear this Master, I'm so excited. Look what I did. You gave me the 5, and here's 5 more. There's even a little detail where what the third servant brings back, it's kind of ambiguous in the text, all kinds of nerdy biblical stuff here, but the way that I almost read the original language, it's almost like he brings back the other 5. What he doesn't bring is all 10. He says, look at the new 5. You gave me this, and now it's this much. And so what does the master say? He says, well done, good and faithful servant. Come and share in my happiness or joy, some translations. You see this relationship between the master and the first two servants? You trusted me with this, you gave me this, and I was able to do this. Isn't this so exciting? This is a different kind of relationship than, Master, I knew you were harsh, you were a hard man, and so here, you gave me this, and I'm giving it back to you. Everything about the relationship between the first two and the master and that third servant and the master is different. I would say that the first two have a relationship grounded on love. The third one had one grounded on fear. And the Bible also teaches us about the relationship between those two things. In 1 John chapter 4, it's written, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because, this is key, fear expects punishment. Is that not what happened in this story? Fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. The third servant saw everything through that lens of fear, and so as a result, he saw his master as harsh, the task is too great, the talent as an opportunity for failure, so he might as well bury it to make sure that nothing happens. And also, something about burying, it's almost like out of sight, out of mind. I don't even have to think about it until the master comes back. I think about all the other ways that we bury things so that we don't have to think about them. I don't know about you, but when I'm tempted to do that, it usually comes in the form of a glass rectangle of some kind when I don't want to think about something, right? Fear expects punishment. But the master didn't want his servants to be afraid. The master wasn't giving duty or obligation. He was sharing with the servants out of his wealth so that they might share in this with him. And I think that's why the master got so upset with the third servant, is that he completely missed what this whole thing was about. If we do see the master as Jesus, who gives love so that we might love others and multiply that love in the world, that's the whole reason that Jesus gives us his love. The master is upset because the third servant buried the love that was meant to be multiplied in the world. And this is why I think you can read this story either directly about money or about the talents or gifts that we have. Either way it works, because either way, the whole point is to see those as rooted in love. And it kind of changes the way that we look at ourselves, that we look at our lives, the way that we look at the things or the gifts that we have. What you have been given by God is a manifestation of God's love. Have you ever thought of it that way? The things that you have, the money in your bank account, the house that you own, the lessons that you've learned in your life, the skills and talents that have developed in your life, those are God's love made flesh in your life. And as a result, it means that just as how God's love is meant to be multiplied in the world, what you have been given, God's love that has been given to you, is meant to be multiplied in the world so that God's love can go forward in this place. This passage is a story about judgment in a chapter all about judgment. But we sometimes think of judgment as if it's this separate thing from love, like how do we reconcile God's love and God's judgment? But I see them as together. That God is so committed to his love and the love that he gives and to love to go out into the world that it makes him upset when that love doesn't go forward. So even though this is a passage about judgment, the message isn't, well, you better live up to your potential with your God-given gifts and abilities or else. That's that demanding picture of God. That's what that third servant thought God was doing. The message is that God has loved you so much and has given you his love made flesh in your gifts. You have God's loves in and with you. And so don't bury your gifts. Don't bury your loves inside of you out of fear. Servants 1 and 2 are invited to share in more joy with the master. And this is the invitation from God. This is why he gives. So let's take this story and bring it right to our lives. Here's the question I think it asks us. How do we see the master? How do we see God? And how do we see our talents, our loves? Do we see through the lens of fear that God is a harsh master that has a standard that we better live up to or else there's punishment? Do we see our lives in the world with a scarcity mindset that says there might not be enough, so I better hold on to it? How about through the lens of risk and vulnerability that says, well, if I put myself out there with my money or with talents or gifts, there's no guarantee that it could go well. It could flop. It could fail. I could fail. I just wonder how many gifts and talents are never explored or cultivated or developed because of a fear of vulnerability, of not being any good. and a fear of shame. Right? If we're talking about fear, we're talking about what happens in our lives when we aren't willing to be ourselves in the world and to put all that out there. That's one of those reasons we're tempted to put that in a hole, isn't it? And that all comes from the root of fear, which I think comes from, how do we see the master? Is the master demanding, or is the master giving you his love? And of course, what we know from, well, any good love story, but also from all the other examples in Scripture, when it comes to love, the greatest risk that we can take is to not risk at all. Right? When we try to not risk and think, well, the safest thing to do would be to put it in the ground, that is the biggest risk. That is what guarantees that we won't be able to share in that master's joy. It almost would have been better if the third servant had tried, if the third servant had put his talent out there and it just didn't develop and it was a lost investment. And for the third servant to come back and say, Master, I tried so hard and I failed and I am so sorry. I think it would have been better if that third servant did that than if he had put it in the ground. Because then at least he would have understood the master and what the master's heart was and what the master hoped for. And I think the master would have been like, okay, thank you for putting this to work. Let's talk about what happened and let's figure out what to do next time. But the master can't work with someone who says, I was just afraid, so here it is. We'll get the dirt off of it, and here it is back for you. Love given, as you can see, is always better than love buried. Always. Even if that love isn't returned. Love given is always better than love buried. Is it safe to say that we live in a world where love doesn't seem to multiply all the time? Is that fair? I don't know, if you read the news cycle, it feels that way. Now, of course, there's all kinds of examples of how love continues to multiply in these quiet ways, and there's the kingdom breaking in all over. But you and I would love to see love multiply a little bit more in the world, wouldn't we? And I think it's often, when we look big picture, it's because we as people are tempted to reserve our love. That can often be in the form of money, this is mine, but also in our gifts and talents. We wouldn't want to waste, or is there going to be enough for me? But God's love will multiply in the world when we are willing to put the love God has given us to work in the world. Jesus says, a new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you. By this, they will know that you are my disciples. When we put love into the world, it tells people about the character of this master so that no one has to be afraid of the master, and we might see love go on. And I think there's a reason that in many of these judgment passages that Jesus tells, whether it's the groom or the master or the king in the sheep and goat story, they often say something along the lines of, get away from me, for I never knew you, and you never knew me. That line starts to make a little bit more sense in my mind when I think to myself, did the third servant really know his master? I mean, think about it. If the third servant really knew his master, would he have buried it in the ground? If he really knew the master, it would have made a lot more sense to act as the other two servants had acted. I think it begs the question, do those who only understand God as harsh and punishing, do they really know God? Do they know God? I want to tie this in and say, a lot of this has to do with how do we see God. I think this is a story that invites us to just spend some time with that. How do you see God? When you are in prayer with God, are you timidly approaching someone that you need to be afraid of? Or are you joyfully entering into a connection with a God who loves you? Perhaps the prayer that we could ask in response to this story is really simple. Isn't it funny how a lot of spiritual stuff comes down to really simple stuff? What if the prayer was, God, help me know you. Help me know you. Now, when I say simple, I don't mean quick and easy and like, oh, just pray this prayer and everything will change immediately. I think we sometimes talk about the spiritual life too flippantly like that, like, oh, if you just pray this, everything's going to be great now. Some of us were raised with other pictures of God. And the images that we have with God, those are like written in our neural pathways. It's on our bones. And that doesn't go away quickly. It might take time. It might take a pattern, a rhythm of praying, God, help me know you. Reveal yourself to me. Show me the depths of your love. Heal me of my fear, including my fear of you. I'm tempted to bury my talent, but I don't want to do that. But I need your help. Can you help me to see you a new way? Jesus tells a story that shows a servant who live out of love and a servant who lives out of fear. It may take some of us time to come out of that mindset of fear. And if that is you, I think welcome to the human race. And let's begin that work of seeking God and asking him to show us a new part of him. Help us to see him in a new way. Perhaps we can even pray this prayer on behalf of others. What if the world could see God in this way of love instead of out of fear? We may need to experience the healing and transformative and perfect love of God to experience that, the love that casts out fear, so that we can begin to risk and to start putting our love out into the world. When we receive God's love, God's gifts as love, we are then set free to put that love to use, to see God's love multiply, to bring back what we have gained to God, and to share in the Master's joy. Now, isn't that a beautiful vision of the kingdom of God? Will you pray with me?